Hey everyone, it's Mr. Miles. I just wanted to do a quick video sort of unpacking the Soapstone and the FIDS graphic organizers that you can see here. Um, so we are going to be using a lot of these in American Lit because American Lit is a class that's very much built around smaller texts, right? We're not going to be reading a ton of books cover to cover in this class. It's going to be a lot of like reading smaller things, poetry, documents, the Constitution, um, speeches, a lot of different varieties of texts that we're going to be unpacking. And so these are tools that we can use to help us unpack them, to help us sort of break these texts down and understand them in clearer detail. Um, and so I just wanted to go over what they are, what they mean, how to use them, and hopefully that gives you an idea of, okay, maybe this can help me in the future, right? And so if you forget how to use them, you can come back to this video, maybe hopefully understand it. Okay, so the first one is SOAPSTone, okay, and that's an acronym. It stands for speaker, occasion, audience, purpose, subject, tone. Okay, so these six things are going to be, just think of it like six different lenses of looking at a text. Like, what are six different sort of angles or facets, right? If I turn the text in my hand and I look at it in different ways, maybe I'll see different things, right? And if I look at it those different ways, then those six things will help me understand the full picture. Okay. And so that's basically what Soapstone and FIDS as well is going to help me do, right? Although FIDS is a little bit more applicable in a lot of different circumstances. You can use FIDS for poetry and fiction and short stories and novels and all sorts of different things. Soapstone's a little bit more for like nonfiction. Okay, so like speeches and documents and tracts and pamphlets and things like that. We're going to read a lot, primarily earlier in the unit. In the semester, we're going to read a lot of this like Soapstone stuff earlier in the year. As we start getting more into the 1800s and the 1900s, we were basically going to be doing a lot more fiction. And so Soapstone will kind of become less important as the year goes on, but it'll be very important as we begin this kind of unit, especially talking about like the Revolution, the antebellum period, where we have to talk about slavery and the abolition movement. We deal with speeches and a lot of nonfiction documents on that. So Soapstone is really important. And so what we're going to do is we're going to kind of break it down bit by bit and try to give you a little idea of how to use Soapstone and how can I apply it. Okay, so I'm just going to think of like a random nonfiction text I could use Soapstone with, like the preamble to the Constitution, right? And so the speaker is our first kind of facet, right? If we're thinking of it like a gemstone, right? It's our first little facet, our first little kind of angle or prism of looking through to see what's going on with this preamble to the Constitution. Okay, so the speaker. A lot of people think that the speaker and the author are the same thing. Oftentimes, yes. Oftentimes, yes. Not all the time, though. And this is a good example to think about because if you look at the preamble to the Constitution, its very famous first line is "We the people," right? Well, the Constitution was primarily written by, like Thomas Jefferson, and then, emendations and corrections by a bunch of other people like, James Madison, things like that. But Thomas Jefferson's primarily the guy writing it. Okay. But he says "we the people." So he is not speaking as Thomas Jefferson, right? He is speaking on behalf of we the people of the United States of America, right? And so you got to be kind of careful because speaker and author, while they oftentimes line up, they're not always identical. Okay. So you got to find out who the speaker is, right? And then what does that person's age, gender, occupation, what does that stuff tell us about them? And possibly give us a little bit of insight into what they might be bringing to this document before we even read it, right? So the example is the Jonathan Edwards, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, right? Well, he's a preacher. Well, obviously, that brings in a certain level of bias or, like intentionality because we know what he is going to try to do. His occupation is as a pastor to save people, to bring people to God, right? And so that is going to be the primary focus of probably whatever he's writing or speaking about. Okay. Age. Okay. Maybe an older person might have a different perspective on a certain topic than a younger person, or maybe a male would have a different perspective than a female would, right? Obviously a male speaking on the topic of suffrage, right? Women's right to vote would be a very different set of biases and preconceived notions than a woman speaking on her right to vote in the 1800s. And so this is why it's important to understand and unpack who the speaker is when we break down the text, right? Because yes, maybe you should be able to interpret the text on its own without bringing the author into it. Maybe. But it's really hard, especially in early American documents, to divorce the author from the text, the speaker from the text. And a lot of times those two are wedded together and we can't really divorce them. We have to not only analyze the text, we have to analyze the author as well, because those two things are very important. And oftentimes they complement each other. So that's why speaker is important. Okay. And so basically it all contributes to the author's voice. The author's voice is basically what all the techniques and all the different things that they are trying to bring into this text, right? So what is it? And so all that contributes to the author's voice. What is their kind of whole kind of persona that they are bringing to this text? And then, obviously that contributes to their point of view. So that's the speaker chunk of it. Okay. And then we got the occasion chunk of it. The occasion, think of it like, again, if the speaker is part of a background information, part of all the, who behind it, the occasion is like the what behind it. The what behind it is, what's the occasion? Why are we writing this? What is the thing that's happening in the real world that's causing this person to speak this or write this? So to go back to the preamble to the Constitution, we have the American Revolution happening, and America is declaring its independence from Great Britain. That is a very important occasion to consider as part of the background information as to why this is important, right? Why are we reading this in school? Well, it's kind of a foundational document in American history. Okay, it's very important. So the occasion, right? The time, the place, the what, the when, the where of it, right? What is behind this document? Okay. 7 years ago, the Abe Lincoln Gettysburg Address. I mean, part of the reason it's called the Gettysburg Address is that it's given at the battlefield of Gettysburg after the battle's taken place, right? That's kind of significant because you have this turning point of the American Civil War and he's giving this address. That's significant, okay? The speech would not nearly have as much significance if we didn't understand that it was coming on the battlefield where 23,000 Americans died, right, over the course of 3 days. So that's the importance of the occasion when it comes to these documents. All right, then we go to audience. So audience is basically the who, right? But if the speaker is the who is speaking, the audience is the who are we speaking to, because that can be very important depending on what kind of document it is, right? If I'm Jonathan Edwards and I'm trying to convert a bunch of people, it's very important for me to speak to my audience where they're at, right? And so Jonathan Edwards speaks to a very specific group of people. He's speaking to the people in his church pews who act like Christians but aren't necessarily behaving like Christians. And so that's an important audience to consider when you read, right? Think about preamble to the Constitution, or probably even better, the Declaration of Independence. Who is Thomas Jefferson writing to? Well, the whole point of it is to declare independence. Who is he declaring it to? Well, the United States already knows that they're declaring their independence. He's declaring it to Great Britain. He's declaring it to King George and telling King George III, here are all the reasons. Here's every single grievance that we have with you. Okay. And this is why we can't take it anymore. Sorry. We got to break this marriage off. Okay. And so that's why audience is significant. Purpose is exactly what it sounds like. Why? Okay. Why are we writing this? To declare independence. Okay. To convert lost people. Okay. To convince people that the Civil War is very bloody and very horrible, but it is not yet over. Our job is not yet finished, and we must stay the course if we are going to bring this nation back together, right? Like that's purpose. Okay. Why? Okay. Are we doing this? The subject is different from the purpose. Okay. The subject's more just like the topic. right? The content, like what is in it, okay? Um, because the Declaration of Independence could be just a very simple document. It could have just been, "Hey, King George, we're leaving," right? And that could have been it. But Thomas Jefferson chose to structure the document so that the Declaration of Independence was, "Hey, King George, we're leaving. Here is a whole bunch of reasons why we think that this marriage can't work anymore and why we just have to break it off and we have to declare independence and make our own country over here." And so the content of the Declaration of Independence is, here's all the reasons why, right? Let me just list all these grievances to you, okay? And basically, so the content is the what's in it, okay? That's the subject, okay? The purpose is the why. Why am I writing it? What am I trying to accomplish? What am I trying to achieve? Um, and so the purpose is, I'm going to declare independence and I'm going to basically communicate that to King George, right? The subject is, well, here's how I'm going about that. Here's how I'm going to do that, okay? And we just examine that by just kind of looking and seeing what exactly is in the document itself, right? And then the tone, right? This is the only one that's actually spelled out in the soapstone. So the tone is like, how does the author feel about their subject, right? It's like, how does Jonathan Edwards feel about lost souls and saving people? Well, he's obviously very passionate about it, right? He's very urgent about it. If he didn't care, right? If he was very apathetic, he wouldn't go to all these lengths, use all these metaphors and figurative language and all this, like, persuasive techniques. He wouldn't do that, right? If he didn't care. But he thinks it's urgent. In fact, he thinks it's so urgent that he's saying, look, you could die in 2 seconds and you'd be in hell, and it'd be over for you because there's no help for you once you're in hell. And so the tone is important. The tone is how does the author feel, right? You listen to the Martin Luther King "I Have a Dream" speech, right? It's very passionate. It's very urgent, right? Like, it's very empowered. You go to the Declaration of Independence. The tone is very sober. It's very almost scientific in a way. It's very just like calculated. Like, here are the reasons we are leaving the Great Britain, and basically we're going to do it whether you like it or not, King George. And I don't think that you can really argue with our logic as to why we're leaving. Right? It's very cold and calculated, right? Like the way Thomas Jefferson lists it all out. And so the tone is significant, right? Because the tone could be very many different things depending on what they're doing. And another important thing about tone is that it could be biased, right? Um, if somebody is a white slave owner, right, in 1800s Georgia, right, then their opinion of Abraham Lincoln being elected is going to be very biased, versus somebody from the North, right? But of course, you can have it the other way as well. You can have an abolitionist be very biased about Abraham Lincoln being elected or the Emancipation Proclamation. You can be very biased the other way, right? And so, what sort of preconceived things are we taking into this text, right? That's very important, okay? Um, and a lot of times the way that we tell tone is we look at the kind of the nuts and bolts of how they write, right? So what are their word choice, right? Jonathan Edwards, there's a reason that he uses God's pleasure. It is God's will. It is God's choice, right? He's just emphasizing over and over again the sovereignty and the power of God, and that you are powerless, and that you are choiceless, and that you have no option but to turn and be saved. Because God is so powerful, and at any moment he can snap his fingers and you're gone. Okay. Imagery, uses very powerful imagery like the spider dangling over the flame. And so the tone is very significant, okay, to help kind of unpack these things. And so that's Soapstone. I'm going to stop the video here and just make this a soapstone video, and then I'll make another one here in a minute that's just FIDS. Okay, so this is soapstone, and hopefully that kind of helps you understand why we use soapstone and what each chunk of this little helpful tool is supposed to do when you break down nonfiction texts.